Hello everyone, I'm Shahzeb Usman and we welcome you to our conversation. Today we will be discussing legal policy, liberal economics, and housing crisis. We are very happy to join with Mr. Abbas Moosvi. Mr. Abbas Moosvi is a research fellow at the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics and currently serving as the editor-in-chief of Discourse, a bi-monthly magazine by Byte on public policy and political economy. He's also a columnist at the Express Tribune and has worked extensively on a wide range of areas in the development sector, including with the USAID, International Trade Center, and the Education Above All Foundation. Hello, Bas, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks for having me.
So, my first question is in very simple terms,
Mhm.
how can you link the housing crisis with the liberal market economy,
Mhm.
which we have seen in Pakistan, especially after these IMF programs?
Yeah, sure. I think it would be a good starting point to just define some of these terms. The liberal market economy obviously refers to three policy directions in particular, one of which is privatization, the other is deregulation, and the third is trade liberalization. And these were the key tenets of the Washington Consensus in particular in 1989. And since then, all of our IMF-led structural adjustment programs and policies in general from the IMF have been in line with that spirit. What that functions to do essentially is it basically takes away power and authority from the state and moves it towards more private capital, private business, and so on and so forth. And generally, the incentive there is to just maximize profits as much as possible. And there isn't any concern about long term planning or development or who is benefiting from these kinds of initiatives in particular. That all of that is sort of pushed under the rug, and most initiatives are with the primary incentive of just maximizing profits for the various players in the market. So, in that domain, I think with housing in particular, naturally that is one of the things that, particularly for low income communities in a country like Pakistan, low income communities are sidelined from that process. They aren't granted any space. Our cities continue to remain inhospitable to low income communities, particularly those that are migrating in search of better economic opportunities from rural communities and so on and so forth. And so, just as a starting point, I would just define those terms. Yeah.
Perfect, perfect. And how do you link with this whole idea of rule of law?
Mm-hmm.
Because we have seen that law in this case acts as an oppressor.
Mm-hmm.
We have seen the attitude of the Supreme Court. It's not very, very friendly to the poor.
Mm-hmm.
We saw, a former Chief Justice basically saying demolition of a lot of homes
Sure.
in Karachi
Mm-hmm.
just for the civic sense or aesthetic
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
So I think the idea of rule of law
Mm-hmm.
has acted as a perpetuator of
Mm-hmm.
this free liberal economics.
For sure. For
So,
sure.
how do you view this, the Pakistani courts,
Mm-hmm.
Pakistani legal framework,
Mm-hmm.
in relation to furthering this idea?
Mm-hmm. No, for sure. I think the liberal doctrine of law, fundamentally, the issue with that is that its central core tenet is
Hmm.
the protection of private property.
Yeah.
And in that way, it serves to promote certain interests over others. In particular, those with access to financial capital will always get a preference over those without financial capital. And so that's why we see when state led authorities will encroach on land for their private gains and so on and so forth. Uh, Courts will generally turn a blind eye to that. However, when poor communities will do the exact same thing, it's a very different approach that we see
Yeah.
from state authorities in general. One of the reasons for this, of course, is the way in which our urban landscapes are structured, the way we approach urban development, urban management, and so on, who work in tandem with one another to promote each other's interests, their objectives, and so on and so forth, in return for a quick buck. And that's why we see the growth of housing, these private housing schemes, which are largely based on a speculative trading approach where people with access to some kind of capital are looking for a quick return. It's all very speculative. They hold on to these plots or these apartments or whatever it may be for a small amount of time, or in some cases, larger amount of time, and just turn it over. There is a statistic on this where plots are generally exchanged about 4 to 5 times before some sort of construction takes place on those. And so it's essentially that basically, and then without any kind of regulation, without any kind of oversight from state authorities, largely because a lot of them are in cahoots with these private developers and state developers. That's why we see constant growth of these kinds of initiatives. And naturally, that crowds out the space that would otherwise be there for low-income communities and so on.
Yeah, I agree. And I think law has acted in a very dubious way here. We have seen law being very, very haphazard. So, for example, in the central government's Lands and Building Ordinance, 1965, it allows the government to evict people living on its land.
Right.
At the same time, the Punjab Kachi Abadis Act says we have to regularize Kachi Abadis.
Yes.
So we have two contradicting set of laws.
Yep.
Although one applies on the federal level, one applies on the provincial level,
Yeah.
but there's a lot of misconstruction of the law in this regard. At the same time, we have these development acts, and we have also these land acquisition acts. Under the Land Acquisition Act, government can acquire land under the public purpose,
Yes.
and we have seen that that public purpose has been misused. We have seen that is used for furthering private interests,
Yes.
and we really have a very, very it's a very hazy definition of what exactly public purpose means. So again, the idea is that the Development Authority Acts also allows you to, and we saw that in Bear Town Limited case too, that you can acquire land and you can have a scheme over it.
Right.
And for that, even a private developer can also apply. And in that, misapplication of the law was observed in the Bear Town Limited case too.
Yes. Yes.
So again, law, I think, has been misused. It has been misinterpreted. It is very, very unclear exactly how it applies.
Sure.
And if there is more lack of clarity, there is more corruption possible too.
Of course.
So I'm very critical of the courts, of the law in general, especially when it comes to working class, when it
100%
comes
for
to
sure.
protecting
Yeah.
people from homelessness. And I think law has been systematically used, the rule of law, the concept of rule of law, to sideline the poor,
Yeah.
I think.
Just to add to that, I think our zoning laws are extremely sort of influenced by our colonial heritage in particular. The floor to area ratios that we allow for are extremely prohibitive to the development of high-rise buildings, for instance. I think we should definitely look into revising those or overturning them even, because if you want to promote inclusive cities, vibrant cities, cities that actually function for ordinary people, those without access to financial capital, you need to have high-rise buildings. You have to have high density, along with high quality public transit services and all of those things. So I think it's important when we talk about housing to look at it from a broader point of view and how it sort of links up with other operative points in the city and so on. The function of high-rise buildings in particular, let's say we have mixed-use high-rise buildings, which means commercial and residential. It will function to increase the supply of housing units, which will inevitably drive down the prices of housing units, making them more affordable to middle class and lower middle class communities. So I think for that particular segment, high-rise buildings would be a great avenue to explore from a governance point of view.
Yeah, definitely. And again, it links to the international law as well.
Yeah.
And it links to the human rights obligations that Pakistan itself has ratified.
Right.
So, for example, under the human rights law, the right to housing is considered as a core right, a right which actualizes other rights.
Yes.
So, if you have housing, you have access, you can save a lot of money to access other things.
For sure.
Like right to education,
Yes.
right to food,
For sure.
and all other human rights. So, under the international law and as an international human rights law in particular, we consider housing as a core right. And if Pakistani government is, for example, evicting people from Kachi Abadis,
Right.
it is a clear violation
Yeah.
of international human rights law, which
For sure.
Pakistan itself has ratified.
100%.
So,
yes.
so how do you think this idea of, do you find any interesting observations about the connection of international law or international human rights law with the housing crisis in Pakistan?
I personally think that Pakistan has subscribed to various kinds of international law over the years, including a lot of labor laws. But the problem, of course, is that it's not actually followed in spirit. It's just on paper. You have, for instance, the ILO, the various laws that come under the International Labor Organization, one of which is the free operation of trade unions, for instance. We don't see any trade unions in Pakistan. So a lot of this is just on paper, and it's a very different sort of picture that you see when you actually engage with, what's happening on the ground. Yeah.
Because I think the human rights law, again, it's so toothless.
Yeah.
For example, human rights obligations say that you have to respect a right, protect
Yes.
it, and fulfill it.
Right.
So the respect obligation upon the government is a negative obligation.
Right.
That you don't have, you will not take any measure that will infringe this right. Okay, you have to do certain things too, but first you have to do nothing
Right.
so that it doesn't infringe
Yes.
it. And when you know demolish kachi abadis,
Yeah.
you infringe this right to respect.
Of course.
Okay, the government doesn't have the resources to provide it, but at least don't demolish it.
Yes. Of course.
So I think again human rights is just most of the time just a jargon.
Yes. Of course.
It is a language which can use for advocacy,
Yes.
but most of the times I don't think so. It has any kind of truth to it.
Of course. Of course.
Anyways, let's go to the next question of ours, and
Just to just finish that, because you mentioned having more of a financial space if we have poor communities that are granted access to housing and so on. Naturally, they'll have more economic freedom to do other things with that same income that they have.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think we talked about trade unions, for instance. One of the things that trade unions do is also in the same sort of manner. They push wages up, they ensure better working conditions, they ensure job security, and so on and so forth. We don't have any of those things functional in Pakistan currently. And the consequences of that cannot possibly be overstated, because that is primarily the reason for why there's so much economic precarity in the first place, right? And so a lot of this obviously has to do with governance arrangements, taking things like civil society seriously, taking things like devolution of power seriously, and so on and so forth. So I think governance also has to be accounted into this.
I totally agree. And I think at the end of the day, you have to empower people who are not powerful.
Yes.
You have to create some balance of power.
Yes.
Because I think in a society, if you leave people to just the benevolence, we cannot do that.
Of
I
course.
cannot trust a normal human being
Of course.
to show me benevolence. And even if it is a benevolence, I think it's just, I don't like saviors too. I want to be a person, or
100%.
you want to be a person who can interact in a society
Yes.
with a respect for each other,
Yes, for sure.
with some semblance of power.
100%.
And I think that all of these rights, like right to housing, right to trade unions, was to reduce the imbalance of power that
Yes.
exists in society.
For sure.
So I think they work in tandem. And I think in human rights law, there is a concept of indivisibility of human rights. Like all rights are so interconnected that absence of one should not lead to presence of another.
Right.
Like if you have one right, it doesn't mean that you don't need to have another right.
Yes,
It
for
all
sure.
comes together.
100%.
And I think that's something which we really need to focus on.
Yes.
When I say housing, I think there was one project that was done in Hyderabad, and I don't remember the exact name of that project. But
Was it Khuda Ki Basti?
yeah, exactly. And I think that was the idea where they just allotted land
Yes.
to the
yes.
poor.
Yeah.
And since they were out of this any kind of tension that they have to get some land, they already were allotted.
Yes.
So they saved some money and they built some structure slowly. And all the government did was to allot them some land
Yes.
and give them a proper title to it.
Right.
And I think that is something which we can do very quickly. So again, I think that if you just give any person who's from low income background a housing right,
Yeah.
I think that will save up 70%
Right.
of his or her income.
Just on Khuda Ki Basti though, I think it's a laudable initiative. I think we can learn quite a lot from that. But there was a statistic that I saw on that, which was that over the course of 8 years, I believe 18,000 individuals benefited from that initiative. I don't think that's a particularly big number. What it suggests is that it might be a good initiative, but it's not scalable. right? It's something that still requires administrative oversight. It still places the onus on low-income communities to kind of just figure it out, just allow them the space to go and slowly construct their houses over time without really any assistance being given to them in that regard. So they're expected to kind of just fend for themselves, even within that domain, which is apparently something that is meant to assist the poor,
Yeah.
right? So there's also an element of patronizing like sort of element to that entire process as well. So it's a good initiative. I think we can learn quite a lot from that initiative, but at the same time, I think we should also think about how these kinds of initiatives can be scaled. One of the criticisms of Khuda Ki Basti was also that it was about half an hour away from Hyderabad.
Okay.
So a lot of the communities that were residing over there still had to make that 30-minute commute, which was extremely expensive for them naturally. So that was also one of the sort of concerns about that. But again, I think we can learn quite a lot from it.
Yeah, I think it was again a project which can be done very quickly.
Yeah.
And again, I totally agree with you that I think it might not be possible to implement that on a very large level.
Right.
But I do think that it can provide an immediate
Yes.
solution to
Relief,
some
yeah.
very, very precarious communities.
Yes, of course.
So I think coming to this idea that then what do you think are some of the ways we can finance low-income housing societies or
Yeah.
housing projects? So, for example, incremental housing we have seen, allocation of land we have seen.
Yes.
There were some projects in Canada where they were giving second mortgages
Yes.
to control speculation.
Right.
A lot of different models we have seen.
Yes, for sure.
So, in your opinion or your analysis, how can we finance low-income projects?
So I don't have a particularly specific answer for you in terms of housing. The way I approach these problems is from an institutional point of view. So one of the things naturally that goes into financing is the financial sector. We don't have a mortgage system in Pakistan. We don't have a mortgage market. Following privatization, starting in the 80s and so on, credit lines were naturally extended to low risk sort of areas where the private sector knew that they would get a guaranteed return from government bonds, for instance, and so on. And they moved away from sort of riskier things like maybe financing individual level entrepreneurs or small and medium enterprises, or even housing, for instance, particularly for low-income communities. So I think the financial sector has to be engaged with from the government side. There has to be some sort of mechanism in place for mortgage systems. And that's how I think we can move towards a sort of system where low-income communities can be, first of all, included in the financial sector. I think only 1 in 5 adults in Pakistan currently are part of the formal financial sector, which is quite the travesty, I think, because when privatization was taking place, one of the things that was used to justify that was that it will lead to a more inclusive financial system. We didn't see that come to pass. So that's, I think, one of the very fundamental things that we have to look into. Secondly, I think when it comes to urban sort of landscapes, we need to move towards high-rise buildings because that is the only way you're going to increase the number of housing units. And if there is appropriate government oversight on the construction methods that are being used, you can ensure good living conditions as well at the same time. And this will not require too much administrative oversight. And I think that would be a good approach to these kinds of things. In rural communities, I think we have to do certain things to address the feudal sort of system that tends to prevail within our rural communities. One of the ways we can do that is through liberating farmers associations, for instance. That will push up prices, increase wages, for instance, improve working conditions. It will also lead to the elimination of things like exploitative debt burdens on a lot of farmers in our rural communities and so on. And that will naturally give them a sort of economic empowerment. It'll give them the financial freedom to actually go and explore things in their own capacity and spend on good quality housing on their own and so on. So those are some of the things we can do. In our urban landscapes, one of the other things is the kind of the fact that there are too many authorities. There,
Hmm.
if you take the example of Lahore, I think there are 5 different authorities that are responsible for the governance of the city.
Yeah.
You have the LDA, you have the DHA, and so on and so forth.
Cantonment, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Each with their own domains
Yeah,
of
yeah.
responsibility, each with their own kind of domains and so on. And the kind of confusion that leads to, that needs to be streamlined. We need to have one authority that is responsible for the governance of the city.
Hmm.
That's a very important part of this, for sure.
Hmm.
So those are the kinds of things that I think we can do to improve housing conditions.
I agree with you. I agree with all of these recommendations. But what I do think that in Pakistan, we are in a very primitive society in terms of economics. I don't think so. Like majority of Pakistanis, I would say 90% or 95% of them, they are living literally on, edge.
Yeah.
I don't even think that they can get into this mortgage systems. They don't like if we are going for a mortgage system, high-rise buildings, all of these ideas I feel worked in West. Although I do think it also gave a lot of powers to banks too, so it was a trade-off.
Yes.
But okay, it provided certain leeway to the people from low-income societies. But at the same time, I also think that Pakistan, the wages in Pakistan are so depressed
Yes.
right now
Sure.
that I think most people just can barely survive
Yes.
for 95% of the
For sure.
population.
For sure.
So I think that the whole ecosystem has to change.
Of course.
Then you have to have more trickling of capital
Yeah.
to the bottom.
Right.
Because you are seeing whenever the market is growing, whenever the economy is growing, it grows only for the rich.
Yes.
Uh,
100%.
I think the banks reported the highest amount of profits recently, even in this economic crisis.
Yes, for sure.
How much was it trickled down? Nothing.
Nothing.
I think in the last government, towards the end, I think the textile owners
Yeah.
earned a lot.
Yes, for sure.
Very few was trickled down.
Big rentier economy there.
Yeah.
For sure.
So I think the people at the top are earning a lot.
Yes.
They first have to trickle it down so that people have a little disposable income
For
to
sure.
go for these mortgages and everything.
Yes.
So again, I think a holistic analysis is required from all sectors, and the government also has to comply with employment laws, labor laws.
For sure.
The government literally begs the capitalists or industrialists to
Yes.
increase the wage.
For
The government should force them.
Yeah.
It's
Exactly.
like-
It has the authority to do that.
Yeah, but so I think again we are in a. I don't know what's happening in the country, but
Yeah.
again, I think there are a lot of ways. I think in some part of the country, one thing can work. Some part of the country, another thing can work.
Yes.
But I think the assumption has to follow the conclusion.
Yes. for
Like
sure.
if we are assuming that mortgage can work, then we also have to assume that people would have to have certain disposable income for that
Yes,
mortgage.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
So I totally agree with you. But
Another
with
thing
my-
on rural settings, I'd say is one thing we have to explore is also the land redistribution.
Yeah.
Land reform is super important. I think that would also be one of the ways, not just to boost economic empowerment of low-income communities, but also lead to things like better governance arrangements, because we have a system of electables in place which is contingent upon land holdings. Land holdings grant big landlords coercive power over their communities, which they sort of leverage to grant certain politicians votes and so on. So that would address that. It would also boost agricultural productivity. We saw a lot of countries around the world, including China, Japan, Taiwan, and a bunch of other countries explore land reform. It doesn't necessarily have to be a violent thing, which was the case in China. We could have something like Japan, where the state was responsible for granting big landlords a certain window of time to demonstrate that they were using their lands in an effective way, in a productive way. If they fail to do that, then the state would just take it over. And I think that is something that we definitely need to explore, because within rural communities, one of the ways you can empower people without access to land is through these kinds of land reforms. Redistribute land, grant them the land. It'll boost productivity, it'll start generating income. And that income can also be used for inputs to the manufacturing sector, which can then go on and boost our exports as well. So all of these things are sort of interlinked, and I think it's important to approach it from a systems analysis point of view. Yeah.
Just a side question. Like I totally agree with you how the East Asian economies did land reform. I think it is
Yeah.
essential.
Yeah.
India even did it.
Of course.
Everybody did it,
Yes.
except us.
Yeah.
So I think that is why I think we just perform. I don't think one of the worst in the world.
Yes.
I think no country has this amount of population,
Yes.
this amount of strategic location, and has performed this bad.
This poorly, for sure.
I think of Nigeria, maybe that's it.
Perhaps.
Even Egypt performed much better than.
Yes.
I recently met an Egyptian diplomat, and she was telling me that the kind of poverty she saw in Pakistan, she didn't even see anywhere.
Right.
And she has a diploma; she's traveled a lot.
Yeah.
And so I think that we have performed one of the worst primarily because we haven't done it.
Yes, of
And
course.
we should have done it just in the first 10 years of our
100%, for
birth.
sure.
But on a side question, how do you think that, do you think we should give private sector the more role or less role in financing these low income projects? Because in the first part of Pakistan, a lot of state funded corporations existed.
Right.
And they did pretty well at that time.
Sure.
Like the State Life Corporation,
Yeah.
Pakistan Railways.
For sure.
They provided, because if there is state owned enterprises, it doesn't have that much incentive for profit. I'm not saying they should get lazy and do nothing, but they also are not that much competitive to to get into very dirty stuff like
Of course.
cheap labor and all that.
Yeah.
So do you think that we should follow that developmental model of initial times, or we should give private sector more role in financing these low income projects? Just want your opinion, because I feel more state efficient, but state-owned enterprises are better. Because you know what we saw with railways in England,
Of course.
they are so expensive.
Yes.
And
Compare that with the Dutch system, for
Yeah.
instance, which is more state control, a lot more efficiency over there. Actually.
exactly,
Yeah.
and railways in England after privatization are horrible.
Yes. Exactly.
And they get late. They
sure.
get like a lot of technical stuff happens to them.
Yeah, for sure. What I would say about that is that I think the government should have a leading role. Some of the things that we can explore are public partnerships, and I think those would be the best way to go about the situation in the short term. But I think the government should always have the central role, especially in planning and like looking forward and trying to sort of estimate the manner in which cities are developing and accounting for that and so on, because the private sector will never do that. They never have an incentive to do that, but they can get certain short-term gains by coming into some agreements with governments, such as, for instance, if they are the contractors in the process of high-rise buildings, construction of high-rise buildings, there's a lot of money to be made for them in that domain, while the government sort of like guides the development along. However, having said that, our government in Pakistan, unfortunately, is not one that is representative of the people's interests. The people that are sitting in government, the people that are sitting in parliament are, these are the electables. These are the people that are part of the status quo. They don't really want change, radical change in any capacity. And so that also needs to be looked at. Some of the ways to do that, as we've already discussed, is through devolution of power, for instance, devolving power to local governments, conducting land reforms, liberating trade unions, liberating civil society, free media, free speech, association. All of those things have to go into this.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, again, it is anybody who's in power, whether that's, as you say, political executive, who is mostly electables, or, medium to large business owners, capitalist.
Yes.
Or then we have the state executive and people in the bureaucracy, whether that's military or civil or judicial. All of them do get a lot of privileged access to housing.
Of course. Yes.
So they don't have an incentive for the working class.
100%. Yeah.
So I think it's just, again, that's idea of extractive state.
Yes.
We have seen that in Pakistan. And I think, again, they don't have any incentive for resolving this crisis.
For sure. Yeah.
And no empathy for that, too.
We talked about neoliberalism. One of the ways to define neoliberalism, a lot of people think that it's the replacement of the government with the private sector, but really what it is the capture of the state apparatus by the private sector.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a good way of thinking about it. Yeah.
And I totally agree. And I think, again, for all the logics for privatization, it is basically that government performs so bad, they're lazy, they're incompetent, there's a very heavy machinery there, so there's a lot of losses. Well, it doesn't need to be like that.
Right.
There was a lot of political appointments in PIA.
Of
There were
course.
a lot of political appointments in steel mill.
Yeah.
You made it like that
Of
first.
course. Yeah,
And
exactly.
of course, now the easy solution is to just kick it out from the government
100%,
sector and
yeah.
put it in the private
Yeah.
basket. And we saw that in Russia after,
Yes.
Soviet Union dissolved. It resulted in oligarchs.
Yes.
And even worse kind of system.
100%.
So that I think that
Mhm.
the state-owned enterprises are not a problem per se. You made it a problem first,
For
and
sure.
then you say, okay, just privatize it.
100%. One of the things about our industrial development
Yeah.
that I feel isn't like talked about too much is the sort of industrial growth that we experienced in the 70s when it was nationalized and so on has been the highest in our history. And a lot of people don't take that seriously.
Yeah.
They don't want to acknowledge that for some reason,
Yeah.
even though it was all state-led. The thing is that if you want to develop, if you want to pursue sustainable growth, you have to invest in certain things, and you need the government's central role in that in order to make that possible. On the other hand, with privatization, if we just stick to public manufacturing enterprises that were privatized, there was a study by the Asian Development Bank, I believe it was in 1998, where they studied public manufacturing enterprises in terms of their efficiency following privatization, and they found that a small fraction of them were found to be more effective and more efficient following privatization. So we have the data on this. This kind of panacea that is
Yeah.
proposed as
Right.
privatization and so on. I think this needs to be challenged for sure.
Yeah, again, I think the rules of the game are very simple.
Yeah.
You collect taxes, more from the rich, less from the poor,
Yeah.
and you fund public services.
Yes.
And I don't think so. We need any foreign country
100%.
to
Yeah.
fund whatever they're funding.
Mhm.
And do you see any tangible work on ground? Like
Mhm.
if they've built, like for example, 1,000 houses, have you seen that?
Nothing at all. No. Like you say, it's a lot of it is just conferences, reports, reams of reports, fancy infographics. You'll see a lot of nice depictions of things, nice photography of poor communities and so on. A lot of it will be talked about in places like Serena and so on, and that's the end of it, really.
And the way they talk, they'll always find problem with the government. Even if the government is doing exceptionally well, they'll find it because that's their
Yes.
bread and butter.
Exactly.
And so they would want to train the government. They would
Yes.
want to develop it. They would want to go on a certain
Yeah.
track. And I find it very fascinating because, for example, when I studied in England,
Mhm.
I had some friends from Latin America,
Mhm.
and they were all on achieving scholarship.
Okay.
And again, and they worked for the government.
Mhm.
And the way I saw them, influenced by their liberal policies,
Right.
and I know that they will go back to their governments. They'll probably rise to the secretary level positions, and they are inherently influenced by it. Like
Of
they
course.
like that philosophy because they were exposed to it.
Of course. Yeah.
So I think that, and you know how this happens in Pakistan too.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of officers go on trainings,
Yeah. Yeah.
and our state executive, all state executives, civil, military, judicial, because of these trainings, because of these scholarships, they become very, very pro-West,
Right. Of
and
course.
they don't have any kind of
100%.
interest.
Yeah.
Although at some level, I feel some of our political executive is more towards, China, Russia. And it was
Yes.
Farley Bhutto at the end of the day
Yes.
who cemented ties with
Of course.
China,
Yeah.
a political person.
Yes. Yeah.
So yeah, I think again, I find development sector totally useless.
I mean, the example of China in particular, I think, is a very important one because the Cultural Revolution that happened under Mao Zedong was primarily based on the premise that China just simply cannot continue to rely on the assistance of the international community. And they took a very comprehensive and hard-line stance on that. And that is the sort of sentiment that fueled the Cultural Revolution. It was one of the central sort of features of it. So, we have a case study right there in front of us, to rely on rents from international financial institutions and so on is just a failing strategy. Pakistan has been doing that since independence.
Yeah.
And it's endless,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, I totally agree.
Yeah.
This is something we should stop. My last question is about climate change.
Mhm.
And again, Pakistan is one of the most vulnerable
Of
countries.
course.
There was a flood.
Mm.
The flood displaced a lot of people
Yes.
and increased homelessness.
Mm.
So, how do you think that the climate change can exacerbate
Mhm.
housing crisis in Pakistan?
Mhm.
And do you find any potential in our liberal theory of economics and law
Mhm.
to counter this dislocation due to climate change?
I think Pakistan is going to suffer quite tremendously if it doesn't take a radical departure from its current governance arrangements due to climate change, in a very direct sort of a way over the coming years. And I don't believe that liberal law has any sort of solutions to this because, like I said, it's based on the fundamental premise of protecting private property.
Yeah.
Protecting private property essentially means you're giving big companies, big corporations, industries the complete right to pursue unfettered capitalism.
Yeah.
We see 92% of global emissions across the world coming from the global north. I think one of the ways countries like Pakistan can sort of begin to address this problem is not through conferences like COP28 and so on.
Yeah.
It's more like I think we need to radically rethink the way we approach foreign policy in that regard. The global south, every country that is disproportionately impacted by climate change, should realize that they're all in the same struggle. They're
Yeah.
all going to be adversely impacted in the same way. And they should have a consolidated approach to sort of push for not just mitigation strategies and funding, but also reparations, not just for climate change, but also for, if you take it back further, for colonialism and so on. There's this great study, I believe the number is 45 trillion USD was extracted from the subcontinent during colonialism. And that is money that was stolen from the subcontinent. So I think those things should be pursued as well. Instead of continuing to take on more loans and calling it the loss and damage fund or whatever it may be, I think those are the things that we need to do.
I totally agree. And I think, again, I really don't think so. Our state executive right now, the way the government is structured, can do anything. And I think the private sector doesn't have the will. Don't have any interest. They're benefiting from all of this. So I think there's simply no action done.
For sure.
Like we just get some millions in Recharge Pakistan. Come on, this is probably not even a budget of one, metropolitan of any developed country.
For sure.
So again, I think the problem is that there is no developed voice or a collective voice
Yes,
from the global south.
for sure.
Like Pakistan, India faces very similar challenges here.
Yes.
But India is going in a very different direction
For
to
sure.
Pakistan geostrategically. Latin American countries, African
For
countries,
sure.
and all of us face the same problems, but there is no collective voice. Because
There's
if
no
there is a
collective
collective voice,
Yes.
probably the West would listen.
For sure.
And China again, I don't know exactly what are they doing on this, but China has the muscle to force West, but I think they have also gone into a very industrialization kind of
Yes, for
development.
sure. They have.
That is very unfortunate, I
Yeah,
think.
for sure.
Uh,
I think one of the things we have this sort of demarcation, this divide between the global north and the south. But really, if you look at the economic sort of relations, there's a very symbiotic relationship that goes on. Their multinational corporations are based here because they get access to free, not free, but like almost free labor. For them, this is almost free. Their entire industries are sort of functioning on that general sort of premise where they have access to free labor, and that's how they sort of maximize their profits and so on. And if we can sort of have some sort of consolidated approach where we say we take a stance on this, where we're like, okay, if you don't take this problem of climate change seriously, then we are going to shut down your operations in our countries.
yeah.
We will see immediate action then,
Yeah.
because that is a direct sort of threat to their economic interests and so on. But for that to happen, naturally, the collective action problem has to be addressed, right?
Again, I agree, and I think there's extreme divisions, sharp divisions. Like you can see people from the same country looking like people from different countries. I think in
Yes.
Pakistan it's very, very apparent,
For sure.
and in other countries too, like Pakistan. And I think that causes the problem. Like the elite is so like they live in some echo chamber in this
Yes,
country
for sure.
that they are not willing to negotiate
100%.
with people in the West, because I think that we have a lot of power. Like if we stop their units and they lose the competitive edge that they get
Yes.
due to our cheap labor,
Yes.
their economy will collapse,
Essentially, for sure.
and their whole economic structure will collapse.
Yes.
And there's a lot of bargaining chips that we have, which are so powerful that
sure.
can force them.
Yes.
But again, the divisions in our society is so harsh
For sure.
that the people at the top simply have no interest. And actually, they are so colonized in their minds
For sure.
that they simply, I think, feel more related
Yes.
with their people in the West than local people.
100%. It's like Frantz Fanon said, these are essentially party organizers for their counterparts in the West. And that's why we see things like tourism being promoted all the time at the expense of ecology in Pakistan.
Yeah.
You know, so that's how it works, you know. It's just a shame, really.
Yeah, and the university that we studied, LUMS, I think, is the best example of this whole
Right.
echo chamber. Like,
Yeah.
Again, there were a lot of talks there,
Yes.
but I don't understand that like most of my friends, our class fellows are abroad, and I'm sure yours too.
For sure.
And again, there is no will, there is
Yeah.
no action. There is a lot of
Not
just
at all. Yeah.
writings and words. So I think unless and until we have something that comes from the very core of the society,
Yes.
which is representative,
100%.
which doesn't talk in English like we are doing, and which just tells exactly what people want with action.
For sure.
I don't think so there would anything happen. And I think development sector has a lot of role in creating these divisions.
Of course. Especially in terms of like the capture of the knowledge production domain.
Exactly.
These folks are essentially capturing any sort of talented researcher that comes up wouldn't actually want to get paid for their services. And
and a
the
lot
only
of
way they
it.
can do that is by going and working for big donor agencies. And
Yeah.
that's how they've sort of captured the knowledge production arena. So we don't even know what our problems are because for good research to take place, it has to be localized research. But donor agencies prevent that from happening.
Yes, thank you so much, and I enjoyed our conversation.
Me too. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.